Stories, Philippines podcast.
In the chill, suffocating dark of a small Romanian convent, a place consecrated to devotion and purity, what horrors could be brewing? What if the vows taken before God became a leash for a power infinitely older and more malicious? What if the very face of sanctity became a mask for a terrifying, predatory evil? Here in the Philippines, a land steeped in Catholic tradition and ancient whisper spirits, the image of the corrupted holy person strikes a particularly deep and ancestral fear. We've seen the shadowed figure of the priest, the nun in our history books, a symbol of colonial power, sometimes benevolent, often tyrannical. But when that spiritual authority is not just earthly but supernaturally twisted, when the very person meant to protect you from the devil becomes the devil's host, where do you turn? I am Paul, and you're listening to Stories Philippines podcast. We are now on the season 86, episode 3 of this awesome podcast. The year was 1952. The location, a remote abbey nestled in the fog-drenched mountains of Romania. The film, The Nun, a cornerstone of the Conjuring universe, paints this picture with broad strokes of Gothic gloom. Carta Monastery, a place so isolated it feels cut off from God's light. The core of the story is simple but terrifyingly effective. A young novitiate, a priest with a troubled past, and a local French-Canadian man are sent to investigate the inexplicable suicide of a nun. What they uncover is not just a tragic death, but an ancient battleground where a powerful demonic entity, Valak, has broken through the spiritual defenses of the convent, possessing the body of a nun and turning the sacred site into a conduit for its evil. This cinematic setup resonates with an uncomfortable familiarity in the Filipino psyche, touching on a nerve that stretches back centuries to the Spanish colonial era. We must understand the historical context of the nun to fully grasp why the image of the possessed nun, the corrupted religious figure, holds such potent horror for us. For over 300 years, the nun, the friar, the Spanish missionary, was arguably the single most powerful figure in the archipelago. More than the Spanish governor-general, the local parish priest held sway over the daily lives of the Filipino people, from birth records to taxes to education. They were the arbiters of culture, the gatekeepers of salvation, and often the de facto local government. Their authority was absolute, their spiritual power seemingly limitless. They were seen as Christ's representatives on earth, capable of wielding the immense power of the Catholic Church. But history is rarely a fairy tale of pure devotion. The power held by the religious orders, Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, was often abused. They accumulated vast tracts of land, intervened in politics, and were sometimes accused of immorality and cruelty. This created a duality in the Filipino relationship with the religious, immense respect and faith mixed with deep resentment and a simmering fear of their unchecked power. This complex history laid the groundwork for a profound cultural anxiety. What if the one person you trust for spiritual guidance is fundamentally corrupt? Now project this fear onto the spiritual plane. In the context of the film, Valak's choice of a nun's habit is a deliberate, blasphemous act. It's not enough to simply possess a soul. The demon seeks to pervert a symbol of absolute purity and devotion. By wearing the nun's veil, the demon is mocking the highest ideal of human sanctity, suggesting that even the most consecrated places and people can be infiltrated and defiled. In the Philippines, our folklore is already rich with tales of spiritual corruption and defiled sacred spaces. Think of the manananggal, a creature that in some versions of the myth is a woman who gained her powers through a pact with a dark entity, sometimes rumored to be a fallen priest or someone who desecrated a church. The tiyanak, an infant demon, is a creature that preys on the innocent, often found near ancient burial sites or even, frighteningly, near secluded chapels. Our understanding of the spiritual world is not one of neat divisions. The light and the dark are constantly bleeding into one another. We have a specific shining concept for a place or person that is corrupted beyond saving. The sinapupunan ng kaliliman, the very womb of darkness. When a church or a convent is compromised, it becomes a balete tree in stone, a majestic, outwardly beautiful structure that secretly houses ancient, malevolent entities. The fear in the film, the sudden realization that the very refuge of faith, the convent, is the source of the evil, perfectly mirrors this deep-seated Filipino dread. The abbey, meant to be a fortress against the darkness, becomes a trap. Consider a location like the San Sebastian Church in Manila, a beautiful, entirely steel structure designed to withstand earthquakes and typhoons. It's a testament to human faith and engineering. But imagine the psychological impact if that steel and stained glass were revealed to be a mere facade for a powerful, unseen horror. The foundations of faith would feel utterly shattered. The film leverages this very feeling. The movie's setting in 1952 adds another layer of global connection. The world was still reeling from the Second World War, the Cold War was beginning, and there was a palpable sense of existential anxiety and a search for meaning. People were looking for certainty in a world that had proven itself capable of monstrous evil. The idea of a demon breaking into a sacred place at this time speaks to a collective fear that even the holiest institutions are vulnerable to the chaos of the outside world. Internationally, this theme isn't unique. The figure of the evil clergyman is a staple in Western horror, from the Jansenist heresy in Catholic history, where a fear of a lack of grace led to extreme asceticism and despair, to the fictionalized possessed priests in films like The Exorcist. The vampire myth, so prevalent in Romania where the film is set, often has an unholy element. The creature is a perversion of life, a soul denied God's grace, sometimes even a corrupted priest. Apricolici in Romanian lore, sometimes associated with lycanthropy, but the general concept of the unholy dead is strong. The underlying cultural belief is the same. The highest virtue, when twisted, creates the deepest vice. In the Philippines, the closest cultural parallel is the mangkukulam or mambarang, who uses religious artifacts in their dark magic, turning a crucifix into a tool of cursing or using holy water to amplify a hex. The power doesn't come from the item itself, but from the blasphemous act of turning something good to evil. The film's exploration of Valak as a demon interested in corrupting belief rather than just killing bodies is the key connection to our own unique cultural anxieties. It suggests a spiritual warfare aimed not at the flesh, but at the very heart of faith. It asks the terrifying question, if God's own representatives can be compromised, then who is truly safe? The very aesthetic of the demon nun, the pallor, the piercing yellow eyes, the stark contrast of the black habit, is a visual representation of this spiritual inversion. It's the opposite of the serene, guiding figure of a nun. It is a parasite wearing the skin of piety. The shadows it casts are not just physical. There are shadows over the fate of an entire people. This is the horror that transcends borders, speaking to a primal human fear of betrayal by the sacred. Before we delve into the more scientific and psychological perspectives on why this particular fear is so potent, let me remind you that your stories are the lifeblood of this podcast. We want to hear about your encounters with the unexplainable, your family's whispers of haunted churches, or that chilling experience that made you question everything you thought you knew about faith. Share your nightmares and your truths. Submit your stories at storiesphilippines.com. The investigation in the film involves a confrontation with a spiritual entity, but for a moment, let's look at this through a psychological lens. The fear of the corrupted religious figure can be understood through the concept of cognitive dissonance. People hold two conflicting ideas. Religious figures are holy and protectors, and this specific religious figure is evil and dangerous. The mind struggles to reconcile these, leading to profound anxiety, distrust, and a breakdown of one's worldview. When the source of comfort becomes the source of terror, the psychological impact is immense. In the Philippine context, the figure of the corrupted fraile embodies this historical trauma and psychological conflict. The Spanish friar was both the source of Catholic salvation and a symbol of oppression. This historical burden makes us particularly vulnerable to this specific type of horror narrative. The film doesn't have to explain the colonial history, but the image itself taps into that ancestral memory of betrayal by the authority in a cassock. The story continues to unfold in the next segment, where we will explore how modern paranormal investigators approach cases like this and look into the deeper theological insights on demonic possession and the violation of sacred vows. The cold, stone walls of Carta Monastery whisper secrets that are centuries old, and they sound remarkably similar to the hushed legends in our own tropical islands. The stone floor of Carta Monastery feels cold even through the soles of your shoes, doesn't it? That relentless chill is the constant, suffocating presence in the film, the demon Balak's own atmosphere. It's not just a physical coldness, it's a spiritual vacuum, a place where grace has been aggressively withdrawn. The narrative of the nun hinges on an ancient evil stirring back to life. The abbey was built to seal a rift, a gateway to hell, a trope that spans countless cultures, including our own. In Filipino mythology, such a place would be a bongangay pipierno, a literal mouth of hell, often sealed by a powerful anito, or, after the conversion, a holy relic. The idea is that power, divine or demonic, is geographic, tied to specific cursed points on the map. Paranormal investigations and the sacred site. If a modern paranormal investigation team were called to the fictional Romanian abbey in 1952 or even today, their approach would blend the spiritual with the technological, looking for patterns that transcend folklore. Their first step would be geographical and historical analysis. They wouldn't just look for ghosts, they'd be looking for residual energy or evidence of a powerful spiritual entity like Valak. They would certainly note the geographic isolation of the monastery. Isolation breeds fear, amplifies natural sounds, and allows psychological distress to ferment. In the Philippines, think of the remote visitas, the small chapels in isolated mountain villages. These places, cut off from the main parish, often become repositories for unique chilling legends. The lack of constant human interaction and the sheer dominance of the surrounding wilderness amplify the feeling that you are alone with something vast and ancient. Modern investigators, even in the 1950s, would be looking for environmental anomalies. Today, that means electromagnetic field, EMF spikes, sudden temperature drops, or electronic voice phenomena, EVP. Disembodied voices captured on recording devices. In the film's period, the technology would be cruder, sensitive thermometers, possibly early acoustic recording equipment, but the goal is the same, to find measurable evidence of the non-physical entity's impact on the physical world. In cases of demonic possession, like the one depicted, the investigators look for signs of unnatural knowledge. Speaking languages the person never learned, knowing secret details about the investigators, or exhibiting preternatural strength. Valak, in its manifestation as the nun, exhibits all these: a deep, ancient malice and a deliberate, blasphemous knowledge of its target's faith. A fascinating part of the film's premise is the breaking of the vow. The nun's suicide is not just a tragic end, it is the breach that allows the demon to fully manifest. This connects directly to the theological insights on vows and sanctity. Theological insights, vows, corruption, and the demonic target. From a theological perspective, a religious vow of poverty, chastity, or obedience is not just a promise. It is a covenant made before God. It is an act of consecration, setting the person apart as a vessel for God's grace. When a place like a convent is consecrated, it becomes holy ground, a spiritual fortress. The strategy of a powerful demon like Valak is rarely to attack the simplest target. Its goal is to inflict the maximum spiritual damage. By possessing a nun, by corrupting the physical symbol of the sacred vow, Valak achieves a form of spiritual terrorism. It aims to sow despair and doubt in the minds of the faithful. If a nun, a bride of Christ, can be corrupted, what hope is there for the ordinary person? In Catholic theology, demons are often considered fallen angels, beings of pure intellect who chose to rebel against God. They don't simply float around. They seek to influence, tempt, and ultimately possess souls. Valak's choice of a nun's form is a potent and strategic spiritual disguise. This concept has parallels in our own Filipino spiritual beliefs. We believe in powerful, malevolent spirits like the Tamao or higher-level Malino, who don a beautiful or trusted guise to lure their victims. The Encanto can appear as a stunning, charismatic figure to draw people away from their homes and spiritual duties. The demon nun is the ultimate terrifying religious Encanto, using the very face of salvation to lead souls to perdition. The film's exploration of Sister Iraine's burgeoning faith and her connection to her past suggests a battle not just against the demon, but against doubt itself. Her investigation is a spiritual journey. In the face of undeniable, powerful evil, the faithful must hold on to the absolute conviction that God's power is greater. This is a crucial element of traditional exorcism rites. The authority and the unwavering faith of the exorcist are more important than any holy water or incantation. It's important to note the cultural belief that the purity of the consecrated object or person is its greatest vulnerability. The more light there is, the darker the shadow cast when the light is extinguished. In the Philippines, we sometimes believe that very holy priests who fall from grace become the most powerful sources of black magic because they possess the deep knowledge of the sacred rituals, which they can then invert for dark purposes. This is the ultimate betrayal. The sacred knowledge turned profane. I have to pause here. I understand the atmosphere is intense, but this is the perfect moment to extend an invitation. If you've been listening for a while, you know the kind of depth and detail we put into every episode. For those who want more, access to the deep research files, behind-the-scenes thoughts on crafting these stories, and exclusive bonus content, I encourage you to join our community, access exclusive content on Patreon, and help us keep the chilling lights on for Stories Philippines podcast, geographical descriptions, and the mood of isolation. Let's return to the stark geographic description of the setting. The film makes the Transylvanian Alps a character in itself. The mountains are shrouded in perpetual mist, the air is heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the approach to the abbey is always through a foreboding narrow pass. This environment is crucial to the horror. It reinforces the idea of being cut off from civilization and divine help. Compare this to a Philippine setting, a remote island convent or a monastery deep within the Sierra Madre Mountains. The tropical equivalent of that Romanian gloom is not cold fog, but the oppressive humidity and the thick, tangled jungle that presses in on all sides. Imagine the silence of that jungle. A silence broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the distant echoing sound of a bird of ill omen. The feeling of isolation is the same, but the sensory details change. Instead of stone, the Filipino setting would feature dark, termite-ridden wood and the sight of mold clinging to the walls, constantly reclaiming the structure for nature. The key descriptive detail in both locations is the overwhelming feeling of the world outside the walls being indifferent or hostile. The world hasn't just forgotten the convent, it actively seeks to swallow it. This geographical isolation becomes a metaphor for spiritual isolation. The characters feel that their prayers cannot escape the valley, that they are trapped in a demon's personal hunting ground. The location enhances the sense of a localized evil that has complete dominance. The narrative continues to build, connecting the psychological fear of betrayal with the physical realities of the cursed location. The Saint's Broken Vow is the title of this episode, and it speaks to the ultimate consequence of this spiritual breach, which we will explore by looking at the scientific attempts to explain away such possession. The fear of the demon nun Valak is powerful because it strikes at the very heart of what we believe about spiritual safety. The abbey is meant to be a hospital for the soul, a place of healing and refuge. When it is corrupted, the spiritual wound is immense. Is the scientific and psychological counterpoint. For every tale of demonic possession and spiritual warfare, there is always the voice of skepticism and the light of science attempting to offer a rational explanation. In the context of the 1952 setting of The Nun, scientific understanding of mental health was evolving, but still relatively crude. A medical or psychological perspective would first approach the tragedy of the nun's suicide and the subsequent strange occurrences not as a demonic incursion, but as a case of mass hysteria, psychosis, or environmental toxicity. Mass hysteria, or mass psychogenic illness is a real phenomenon where symptoms of an illness appear in a large group of people when there is no physical or environmental cause. In a cloistered, highly stressed, and deeply religious community like the Abbey, the trauma of one suicide combined with the isolation and rigid lifestyle could trigger shared visions, auditory hallucinations, and a pervasive sense of dread. The fear of a demon, a culturally accepted concept, becomes the narrative container for the shared anxiety. Furthermore, a psychologist might look at the psychological profiles of the key characters. Father Burke, the priest sent to investigate, is tormented by his past failure during an exorcism. Sister Irene is a novice wrestling with her own unique visions and identity. These characters are already psychologically primed to see the supernatural. Their personal guilt and spiritual struggles are projected onto the environment, manifesting as the demonic presence. In the Philippines, we understand this concept through the idea of a bali na nababagbag, a person whose mind is deeply troubled and easily manipulated by both the living and the unseen. If a nun were exhibiting strange behavior in a remote area, an observer might immediately assume demonic influence, when in reality, the person might be suffering from schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, or clinical depression. The extreme asceticism and restrictive lifestyle of a nun in the 1950s, the lack of sleep, fasting, and intense focus on spiritual warfare could also induce states of altered consciousness, making them more susceptible to vivid religious hallucinations that are then interpreted as demonic vision. Another scientific consideration is environmental factors. In a very old, damp structure like Kata Monastery, the presence of toxic molds or even carbon monoxide could cause neurological symptoms like confusion, delirium, and hallucinations that mimic possession. The pervasive, evil atmosphere might, in part, be bad air or fungal spores affecting the occupants' minds. However, the film and the core of the spiritual horror compels us to push past these rational explanations. The sheer malice and the unnatural intelligence displayed by Valak push the narrative back into the realm of the theological, confirming the horror that science can't always contain. The story we are examining is deeply rooted in the universal fear of the loss of control and the betrayal of trust. It's a compelling piece of modern folklore that echoes the ancient fears of our own islands. Before we delve into the deeper connections between Filipino folklore and the concept of the corrupted saint, allow me to share an important message. We pour immense effort into bringing these detailed, immersive stories to life, complete with historical research and cultural context. If you value this journey into the shadows of Philippine history and legend, your financial support makes a huge difference. Find show notes and support options in the description of this episode. Every contribution helps us continue this important work. Filipino folklore, the corrupted nun, and the mangkukulam. The cinematic demon, nun, is an external entity wearing a religious mask, but Filipino folklore has its own chilling versions of the corrupted spiritual figure. But the historical memory of the nun often overlaps with the legend of the mangkagamot or albularyo who turns to dark arts. We have tales of priests who, having lost their faith or succumbed to temptation, become powerful users of black magic. Because they possess the Catholic rituals and the sacred Latin, they are uniquely equipped to invert these powers. Consider the legends of the mangkukulam, the priest-sorcerer. He doesn't need a foreign demon. His power comes from his blasphemous acts, saying the mass backward, using consecrated hosts for dark spells, or conducting rituals in the cemetery instead of the chapel. He is a terrifying figure because his power is self-generated through the willful betrayal of his sacred vows. This is a far more personal and culturally resonant horror than the external demonic possession seen in the film, yet the theme of sanctity betrayed is identical. Another parallel is the way spiritual power is viewed. In the film, the abbey is built over an ancient, sealed portal of evil. In the Philippines, we have specific places called lugar en hiwaga, places of mystery or power, which are often ancient burial grounds or sites of powerful datu, chiefs or babalan, spiritual leaders. When the Spanish built churches over these native sacred sites, they were often said to be merely layering Christian power over the existing powerful spirits. Sometimes, the Christian faith failed to fully exorcise the site, and the old spirits, the diwata or the maligno, simply waited, integrating themselves into the church's shadows. When a nun is possessed by Valak, the horror is the corruption of the individual. When a church is built on a cursed site that was never fully cleansed, the horror is the corruption of the place itself. Both scenarios leave the faithful nowhere to turn. The visual contrast in the film, the beautiful yet menacing Gothic architecture, is essential. It represents the majesty of God being mocked by the demon. In the Philippines, the beautiful Baroque churches with their massive stone walls and intricate carvings carry the same symbolic weight. If the stones of Miagao Church in Iloilo, for instance, were suddenly revealed to be weeping blood or housing a powerful tikbalang disguised as a saint, the shock would be overwhelming. The foundation of faith itself would seem to crumble. The theme of the broken vow extends beyond the nun's suicide. The vow of the Catholic Church is to protect its faithful. When the church or its consecrated representative fails and becomes the source of terror, it constitutes a broken spiritual promise to the entire community. This is why the horror of the nun resonates so deeply in a Catholic country like the Philippines. It is a theatrical realization of a centuries-old anxiety. The abbey's shadows deepen, and the chilling silence of 1952 Romania seems to press in on us. The terror of the nun isn't just about the jump scares. It's about the psychological damage caused when spiritual trust is obliterated. The demon Valak understands this perfectly. Its target is the soul, and its weapon is doubt. International dalao parallels to the broken vow. The fear of a corrupted spiritual leader or a defiled sacred space is not unique to the Philippines or the Christian tradition. It's a global, primal anxiety. Examining these international parallels helps us understand why the premise of the nun resonates so universally. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the concept of Isfet, chaos, violence, and injustice was the eternal opponent of Mawat, order, truth, and cosmic balance. When a priest of a major god, like Amundra, was corrupted, they were inviting Isfet into the heart of the kingdom's spiritual structure. This wasn't just personal sin, it was a threat to the cosmic order itself. The Egyptian fear was that the corrupted priest could destroy the spiritual harmony of the entire world. Moving to Japanese folklore, the Oni, powerful demonic ogres, sometimes wear the disguises of Buddhist monks to infiltrate monasteries or villages, preying on the faithful who offer them shelter. The difference between an Oni and Valak is largely cosmetic. Both are high-level demonic entities using a spiritual uniform as a tool of deception and betrayal. The Buddhist monk's robe is a symbol of detachment and enlightenment. The Oni wearing it mocks the spiritual journey. In West African spiritual traditions, specifically Vodun, the concept of a Hugan, priest or Mambo, priestess, who falls to using their powers for destructive ends is known. This is a deliberate, malicious turning away from the service of the good Loa, spirits to serve darker, often destructive entities. Such a corrupted spiritual leader is feared not just for their power, but for the way they invert sacred rites to bring curses and chaos. What all these cultures share is the understanding that a person who has attained a high level of spiritual access or sanctity possesses a corresponding potential for immense evil should they choose to betray their calling. The higher the pedestal, the greater the fall, and the wider the ripple effect of that spiritual collapse. The demon nun is simply the modern, Gothic face of this ancient global anxiety. I want to pause the narrative here, but not the connection with our audience. Remember, this podcast is a two-way street. We learn as much from your input as you do from our research. To keep these stories flowing and to connect with others who share a fascination with the darker corners of history and folklore, be sure to follow us. Follow us on social media for daily folklore facts. We share quick bits of history and chilling cultural beliefs you won't find anywhere else. Detailed geographic descriptions, finding the Philippine Abbey. To make the horror of the nun truly resonate within a Filipino framework, we need to imagine a Philippine location that embodies the same sense of isolated sanctity and ancient layered power as Carta Monastery. Imagine a place like the old Convento de Santa Clara, not the actual one, but a fictionalized version, situated on the small remote island of Fuga off the northern coast of Luzon. The island is rugged, known for its strong winds, ancient burial grounds, and a feeling of being perpetually cut off from the mainland civilization. This fictional convent, built in the 1800s by the Dominicans, would be made of thick black and coral stone and molave wood, structures that have survived centuries of typhoons. The air is not cold, but heavy with the ocean's salt and a sticky, oppressive heat. Instead of the thick mists of Romania, the convent is often shrouded in the sudden, blinding downpour of a tropical storm or the strange, yellow-tinged haze of the dry season. The horror in this Philippine setting would be amplified by the constant encroaching jungle. The demon isn't sealed in a vault of stone. It is whispering from the balit trees that press against the convent walls. The floorboards of the chapel creak, not from the wind, but from the relentless burrowing of bukbuk, wood borers, a sound that mimics the relentless march of decay and spiritual rot. The soundscape would be terrifying, the incessant, high-pitched whine of cicadas at dusk, the distant, mournful cry of an unknowing night owl, a common omen of death, and the relentless crash of the waves against the cliffs, a sound that promises no escape. A suicide in this isolated tropical convent would not just be investigated by the authorities, it would immediately be ascribed to the Malino, the ancient spirits who were disturbed when the church was built over their domain, now seizing the opportunity to claim a soul, or perhaps the nun who became a mambabarang is responsible. The local fear would be immediate and absolute. The boundary has been broken. The physical atmosphere of Carta Monastery, the claustrophobia, the endless shadows, the sense of profound age, is mirrored perfectly in this isolated Philippine setting, reinforcing the idea that evil finds the weak points in both geography and faith. The environment itself becomes an active, terrifying character. The narrative thread connecting Valak in the gloomy Romanian abbey to the deeply rooted fears of the Philippines is the ultimate spiritual deception. It's the ancient, chilling idea that the most sacred authority can be the most monstrous threat. The Saint's Broken Vow, a modern reflection on ancient fear. The title of this episode, The Saint's Broken Vow, speaks to the moral and theological catastrophe at the heart of the nun. A vow is a promise to God. When that vow is broken, especially the ultimate vow of chastity and dedication symbolized by a nun's habit, it creates a spiritual void that, according to theology, a demon is eager to fill. The film's demon Valak is often interpreted as a parasite of faith. It doesn't just want bodies, it wants the authority and despair that comes from corrupting an icon. Consider the role of the cross in the film. It is the ultimate symbol of victory over evil. Yet in the demon nun's presence, the cross seems to lose its power, or the power must be wielded with absolute, unwavering faith, something the characters struggle to maintain. This reflects a core belief in the Philippines. A bentike, a religious amulet or a rosary, only works if the person holding it has a genuine, uncorrupted faith. A priest or nun who loses their spiritual conviction renders the sacred objects in their possession inert or worse, susceptible to being turned to dark purposes. This links to a concept we see in the practice of albulayo, traditional healers. A powerful albulayo is not defined solely by the herbs they use, but by the spiritual force they command, which is deeply tied to their own moral integrity and sincere devotion to their faith, be it Christian or indigenous. A corrupt albulayo becomes a terrifying mambabarang or mangkukulam. The spiritual authority is flipped from healing to harming. The horror in 1952 Romania wasn't just physical. It was the crushing realization that sanctuary was an illusion. This shattering of the safe space is something that resonates profoundly in a culture like ours, which relies heavily on the collective spiritual protection provided by the church. The film serves as a modern piece of cautionary folklore, echoing the older warnings embedded in our own legends. It warns against placing blind, absolute trust in the symbol over the integrity of the spirit beneath, the habit, authentic Filipino characters, and the terror of the nun's shadow. To personalize this fear, let's imagine a family in 1985, Philippines, watching the nun in a small provincial town where the shadow of the old nun still looms large in the community's memory. We have Cecilia Amparo Galang, a devout mother in her late 50s who still remembers her grandmother's whispers about a certain Spanish friar in the 1930s who was rumored to secretly be an aswang's protector, demanding tributes in exchange for the town's safety from nighttime horrors. Cecilia sees the demon nun's pale face and is instantly reminded of the nun's face in her grandmother's stories, a face that seemed to have no true human warmth. Her son, Ramon Felix Bituin, a young man in his 20s who is studying psychology in Manila, tries to offer scientific and psychological perspectives. Ma, he might say, it's just the isolation and the poor light. They're projecting their fears. It's a form of shared delusion or environmental psychosis. But Cecilia counters with the profound wisdom of lived generational fear. The demon doesn't have to be Valak, Ramon. The evil spirit wears the habit because it knows that the greatest power it can steal is not the nun's soul, but our trust. If we cannot trust the nun, we cannot trust the church. And if we cannot trust the church, where do we go when the darkness comes? This exchange captures the essence of the Filipino connection to the film, the rational, modern mind against the ancestral, spiritual knowledge. The demon nun is not a new entity to them, it's a reimagining of the evil authority figure they've been warned about for centuries. The story of the saint's broken vow is thus not a foreign tale. It's a terrifying mirror reflecting our own historical anxieties about power, faith, and betrayal. The Nunyer set of 1952 is merely a backdrop for a fear that has existed in the Philippines since the first stone church was built on sacred native soil. I want to remind everyone listening that the real terrifying stories often happen in the quiet moments, in the places where faith and folklore collide. If you have an experience, an inherited fear, or a family legend that fits the chilling atmosphere of this podcast, we want to hear it. Don't let your stories fade into the tropical night. Submit your stories at storiesphilippines.com. The cold truth about the nun is that it doesn't just show us a demon, it shows us the vulnerability of belief. In the profound silence of the corrupted abbey, the characters are forced to confront whether their faith is strong enough to resist an evil that wears the very uniform of salvation. The dark history of power and the nun na. We must return to the historical context to fully appreciate the depth of the Filipino response to the corrupted holy figure. The nun in the Philippines held a unique position not shared by priests in many other colonies. They were not merely spiritual advisors, they were instruments of the Spanish state. This duality meant their corruption was both a spiritual tragedy and a political betrayal. During the centuries of Spanish rule, the immense power of the religious orders led to conflicts, most famously the Cavite Mutiny of 1872, which resulted in the execution of the three priests Gomburza. This event, along with countless localized abuses, cemented the nun not just as a figure of piety, but sometimes as an oppressor. When we look at the demon nun Valak, we see this historical anxiety made flesh. The demon's power is not just supernatural, it is institutional. It uses the authority of the church structure, the confinement of the convent, the obedience demanded by the vows, to trap and terrorize its victims. This echoes the historical memory of Filipinos who felt trapped by the immense, sometimes cruel power of the Spanish religious orders. Horror is compounded because it's a spiritual entity using a familiar, historically abusive structure. The film operates on the principle of spiritual entrapment. The characters are sent to a holy place to find peace and answers, only to find the door locked behind them by the very evil they sought to fight. This resonates with the experience of the colonized who, having embraced the faith of their conquerors, sometimes found that faith used as a tool of oppression. Consider the concept of confession in this light. It's meant to be a moment of absolute vulnerability and spiritual cleansing. If the priest is corrupted, the sanctity of that sacrament is destroyed and the vulnerability becomes a liability. The demon nun is the physical manifestation of a confessor who knows your deepest sins and uses them against you. This is a fear that transcends generations. Cecilia Amparo Galang's grandmother feared the nun of the 1930s because he held the keys to both heaven and the local jail. The modern Filipino viewer fears Valak because the demon holds the keys to both the convent and the pits of hell. The costume changes, but the terror of the corrupted authority remains the same. Theological implications, the banality of evil. The theological horror of the nun is in the demon's banality. Valak doesn't arrive in a shower of fire and brimstone. It lurks, it whispers, it wears a quiet disguise. It is evil made institutional and mundane. The demon is not simply trying to convince people that God doesn't exist. That would be too simple. It is trying to convince them that God does not care, that His protection is conditional, and that the promise of sanctity is a lie. This aligns with a deeper, more profound theological insight into the nature of temptation and sin. Major theological traditions teach that the devil's greatest victory is not in making people commit grand evil acts, but in sowing despair and apathy. The demon nun achieves this by demonstrating that even the most dedicated can fall, thereby eroding the spiritual certainty of all who witness the horror. It is the ultimate psychological and theological weapon. In the context of the Philippines, where faith often involves powerful communal displays of devotion, the pabasa during Holy Week, the vast processions, the demon nun serves as a stark warning. Outward piety is not a guarantee of inner grace. The evil can hide behind the thickest wall of stone and the heaviest religious habit. The climax of the film, often involving the use of a sacred item or a powerful relic, is always a confrontation between unwavering faith and absolute malice. It is not the object that defeats the demon, but the belief and the spiritual will of the person wielding it. This reinforces the core message. The power is within the person, not just the paraphernalia. And I want to take a moment to thank all of you who share these stories, both the historical truths and the chilling legends with your friends and family. Your enthusiasm helps us reach more listeners. Please take a moment now to like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast. Your support, both in listening and financially, is what keeps Stories Philippines podcast alive. Financial support options are easily found in the show notes. The air in the abbey is thick with dread, a place where the scent of incense has been violently replaced by the stench of spiritual decay. We are deep into the heart of the fear that the nun exploits, the terror of the corrupted vessel. Modern paranormal investigations, the search for Valak's signature. If modern paranormal investigators, with their advanced tools, were able to step into Kharta Monastery, they would be looking for what they call a demonic signature. This is more than just a typical haunting. It implies an entity with intelligence, strategic intent, and a profound, localized effect on its environment. Investigators would utilize full-spectrum cameras to capture images beyond the visible light spectrum, searching for fleeting shadow figures or unnaturally dark masses, like the one that often appears behind the figure of the possessed nun. They'd set up laser grids to detect any three-dimensional displacement of light, hoping to catch the physical form of Valak moving through the halls. Crucially, they'd use geomagnetometers to map the site's magnetic field. Demonic activity, often associated with powerful energy manipulation, is sometimes linked to radical fluctuations in the magnetic field, often registering extremely high readings. In the abbey's vault, where the demon is supposedly sealed, they would expect to find a persistent, powerful anomaly, a cold spot that defies natural explanation, an area of high electromagnetic interference. However, the film and the underlying folklore remind us that a spiritual entity like Valak is capable of manipulation. It doesn't always want to be caught on camera, it seeks to play mind games. This is where the psychological perspective intersects with the paranormal. The demon's greatest power is not its strength, but its ability to induce fear, doubt, and paranoia, making the investigators question their instruments, their sanity, and their fate. In the Philippine context, we might call this the gala of a powerful spirit. It's trickery or deception. An investigator might catch an EVP that sounds like a nun whispering a prayer, only for the next EVP to be a guttural, demonic laugh. This constant spiritual gaslighting is what makes the investigation so terrifying. The target is the investigator's own mind and spiritual conviction. Global connections, the unholy hierarchy. The demon Valak is described in various real-world occult texts, specifically the Lesser Key of Solomon, as a powerful spirit or great president of hell. This elevates the horror beyond a simple ghost story and places it within a framework of unholy hierarchy. It's not just a minor spirit, it's a high-ranking officer of darkness, and its presence suggests a targeted, large-scale spiritual operation. This concept of an organized demonic hierarchy has parallels in Filipino folklore. We don't just have generic maligno, we have spirits with specific ranks, powers, and domains. For example, The tamawo, high-ranking, often beautiful supernatural beings, are feared more than a simple duende because they possess greater intelligence and strategic malice. They are the spiritual elite of the other side. When an entity like Valak targets a religious institution, it's a declaration of war. It uses its intellectual power, its knowledge of the saints, the rituals, and the personal histories of the clergy to methodically dismantle the faith from the inside out. This isn't random haunting, it is spiritual siege warfare. The broken vow is the opening they seek. This global connection confirms the pervasive cultural belief that evil is often intelligent and organized, and that the spiritual world is a complex field of battle, not a simple playground for ghosts. The presence of a high-ranking demon like Valak suggests that the Abbey's problem is not a simple haunting, but a crisis of faith that could spread far beyond the mountains of Romania. We're weaving together history, faith, and fear, exploring how a film set in 1952 speaks to the soul of the Philippines. We want this connection to be a two-way conversation. If you found yourself drawn into the dark corners of our episodes, please consider helping us continue this work. Access exclusive content on Patreon. Your support helps us unearth more chilling tales and provides you with special access to our research and bonus content. Theological synthesis, the power of authority and consent. The final, chilling theological insight centers on authority and consent. The film implies that Valak needed a breach, a nun's suicide, a broken vow to fully manifest. Demonic entities, according to most theological traditions, cannot simply walk onto holy ground and take control. They need some form of invitation or catastrophic failure of the spiritual defenses. The vows taken by the nuns are their spiritual armor. When one of them breaks, the armor cracks. The act of suicide is, theologically, an act of absolute despair, a rejection of God's grace and the hope of salvation, which is often seen as the ultimate victory for a demon. The investigation in the film, Father Burke's struggle with his past exorcism, Sister Irene's own questioning of her future, is about them trying to reassert their spiritual authority. They must move from doubt to certainty, from fear to faith. The defeat of Valak is achieved not through brute force, but through a definitive, courageous act of reconsecration, a reaffirmation of the broken vow. A nun of history often operated with unquestioned authority. The film forces the characters to realize that true spiritual authority comes not from the clothes they wear, but from the unwavering moral and spiritual clarity they possess. The demon nun forces a terrifying spiritual test. Do you trust the symbol, or do you trust the God behind the symbol? In the deepest shadows of Carta Monastery, we find the same questions that have haunted the most remote corners of the Philippine archipelago for centuries. The demon is merely a catalyst for revealing the weakness and the ultimate strength of human faith. The chilling story of the demon Valak reaches its darkest conclusion, leaving us to sift through the dust of history and the rubble of broken faith. The saint's broken vow is an examination of what happens when the supposed light of God is extinguished by a spiritual entity that seeks to wear its sacred clothing. Cultural beliefs and their international parallels, the veil of deception. The nun's habit is perhaps the most powerful piece of symbolism in the film. It represents absolute devotion, self-effacement, and purity. Valak's choice to adopt this form is not accidental. It's a deliberate, calculated strike against the spiritual defenses of the world. This idea of the spiritual disguise has profound resonance across cultures, highlighting a universal human fear of deception by those they trust most. In Norse mythology, the trickster god Loki constantly changes his shape, often taking on benign or even sacred forms to manipulate and cause chaos among the gods and mortals. The shapeshifter, whether divine or demonic, is a figure of ultimate betrayal because it violates the fundamental expectation that things are as they appear. In Filipino folklore, we have the aswang who takes on the appearance of a beautiful woman or a kindly relative to lure victims to their death. The key to the aswang's horror is not just the killing, but the deception, the moment of realization that the person you trusted, the face you loved, is actually a monstrous, flesh-eating entity. Valak is the religious aswang. It uses the ultimate symbol of spiritual purity to conceal its monstrous intentions. The habit provides psychological cover and institutional authority. The people who see the nun are conditioned to trust, to obey, and to seek sanctuary. When they realize the deception, the psychological damage is complete. The fear of the corrupted nun in our history becomes the fear of the demon nun on the screen, a seamless transfer of ancestral anxiety. This cultural parallel is essential. The horror is amplified because it taps into the intergenerational trauma of spiritual and political betrayal. The fear is not just of the supernatural, it is the fear of authority turned malign. We've been through the chilling history and the modern horror, but this podcast is only possible through the dedication of our listeners. To ensure we can keep crafting these in-depth immersive episodes that blend folklore and history, we need your help. If you haven't already, please consider supporting us. Find show notes and support options in the description of this episode. Your support is our lifeblood. Detailed geographic descriptions, the isolation of the vow. The geographic isolation of Carta Monastery plays a critical role in the film's success. Isolation is the perfect incubator for both despair and supernatural malice. It removes the comforting presence of society, the structure of the outside world, and the ease of getting help. The Transylvanian Alps are visually stunning but menacing, a landscape of jagged peaks and deep shadow-filled valleys. The abbey is situated in a kind of spiritual and physical cul-de-sac, where the only path leads further inward toward the horror. The sound of the monastery bell, which should be a signal of community and prayer, is muffled by the surrounding geography, becoming instead a lonely, mournful echo. Imagine the similar geography in the Philippines, a secluded convent established on a high cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in the Batanes Islands. The stone of the old churches there is thick and dark, built to withstand the harshest weather. Here, the horror wouldn't be silence, but the constant roaring wind and the pounding surf, sounds that can easily mask a scream or distort a prayer. The feeling of being trapped is identical. The convent is only accessible by a single, winding, and often storm-battered road, mirroring the one-way in and out of the Romanian Valley. The geography reinforces the core narrative. You are alone in your faith, no help can reach you, and your only protection is the strength of your own spiritual conviction. The demon thrives on this isolation, chipping away at the characters' resolve until they feel completely abandoned, not just by the world, but by God Himself. The conclusion? Lingering questions. The film and our discussion ends not with a neat resolution, but with a deep, unsettling connection to the larger Conjuring universe, reminding us that Valak's presence lingers, moving from the remote abbey to the modern world. The demon's influence is never truly contained. The Saint's Broken Vow is a story about the fragility of human sanctity. It asks us to look past the beautiful symbols of our faith and examine the integrity of the people who wield that spiritual authority. It reminds us that the greatest evil often hides in the most trusted places. As we conclude this exploration, we are left with a fundamental, terrifying question that echoes in the dark corners of every old church and every silent convent, from the Transylvanian Alps to the mountains of Luzon. If the highest vow of devotion can be shattered and the most sacred places can be corrupted, how can any of us truly be sure where the danger ends and where true salvation begins? This has been Stories Filipinas podcast. Join us again next time as we dig up another story that binds our dark history, chilling folklore, and deep-seated beliefs. Did the horror of the corrupted nun of Philippine history prepare us for the demon nun, or is this a universal fear that transcends time and geography? We invite you to share your thoughts and your support. Like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast with someone who enjoys a good chill. You can support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. Until the next moonless night, always keep your faith close, but keep your eyes open.